The truth is, most people misunderstand this. We are systematically spoon-fed a deeply comforting but ultimately catastrophic fairy tale from the very moment we are capable of comprehending language. Society, in its grand, sweeping orchestration of compliance, hands us a rigid, heavily polished script. This script mandates that we must surrender the absolute most vibrant, energetic, and physically capable years of our brief human existence to the grueling, fluorescent-lit altars of corporate conformity. We are sternly instructed to trade our irreplaceable, finite hours for a painfully incremental, heavily taxed trickle of currency, to religiously hoard a meager 10% of that trickle into volatile, unpredictable market funds, and to sit in agonizing, hopeful silence for 40 continuous years. We are told to aggressively clip coupons, to completely deny ourselves the simple, daily joy of a morning coffee, and to live a life of suffocating, miserable frugality so that, if we are incredibly lucky and the unpredictable macroeconomic forces of the world do not completely devour our life savings, we might finally experience the intoxicating taste of millions when we are confined to a wheelchair. Our bones brittle and our youth long, tragically extinguished. This is the universally accepted dogma of the slow lane, a sinister, highly deceptive financial roadmap that actively steals the golden years of life under the false, glittering guise of responsible planning. But the profound narrative woven into the core of this revolutionary philosophy violently tears the mask off this deception, exposing it as a rigged, mathematical impossibility designed to keep the masses pacified, exhausted, and eternally bound to the mechanical wheel of endless, unfulfilling labor. The shattering of this monumental illusion begins with a seemingly mundane, yet entirely life-altering encounter, experienced by a young, highly observant protagonist representing the awakening of the modern seeker, walking down a quiet, unremarkable suburban street, savoring a cheap ice cream cone and fully, quietly resigned to the heavy, mediocre expectations placed upon his shoulders by the surrounding world. The protagonist's reality is suddenly, violently disrupted by the deafening, guttural roar of a mechanical beast. A pristine, breathtakingly aggressive Lamborghini Countach pulls up, its sharp, angular lines cutting through the mundane, sleepy atmosphere like a meticulously forged blade. The protagonist, heavily conditioned by the standard societal script, immediately assumes the driver must be an ancient, silver-haired aristocrat who spent 5 grueling decades pinching pennies, or perhaps a reckless lottery winner who stumbled into a blind, mathematically impossible stroke of cosmic luck. But as the iconic scissor door swings upward, the driver emerges, and the protagonist's entire paradigm instantly, irreparably fractures. The driver is absolutely not ancient, he is a vibrant, energetic young man in his mid-20s, dressed casually and radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable sovereign freedom, driven by a sudden, desperate, and overwhelming necessity to understand this impossible anomaly. The young seeker approaches the driver and asks the singular, profound question that would alter the trajectory of his existence forever. What do you do for a living? The young millionaire pauses, looks at the seeker with a calm, steady gaze, and delivers a highly concise, 3-word answer that acts as a psychological earthquake. I am an inventor. In that incredibly brief, fleeting moment, the colossal, suffocating lie of the get-rich-old mandate is permanently destroyed. The seeker realizes, with a rushing, dizzying wave of absolute clarity, that immense wealth and vibrant, pulsing youth are not mutually exclusive. The universe possesses a hidden, entirely different set of physical and economic laws for wealth creation, a high-speed trajectory that completely bypasses the grueling, 40-year crawl. The quest for the fast lane has officially, irrevocably begun. To truly comprehend the deep, underlying mechanics of this high-speed trajectory, the narrative forces a brutal, uncompromising dissection of the 3 distinct financial roadmaps that dictate the ultimate destiny of every human being on the planet. The vast, overwhelming majority of society wanders blindly, entirely unconsciously onto the first, most dangerous path, the sidewalk. The sidewalk is absolutely not a pathway to a defined destination, it is a chaotic, spinning, and deeply exhausting treadmill suspended precariously over a bottomless financial abyss. The individuals tragically trapped on the sidewalk are entirely enslaved to the primal biological urge for immediate, fleeting sensory gratification. They view money not as a powerful, leveraging tool for engineering freedom, but as a volatile, temporary fuel for acquiring rapidly depreciating status symbols. They furiously, recklessly spend every single cent they earn, and often significantly more, financing luxury vehicles they absolutely cannot afford, buying sprawling, echoing homes heavily mortgaged to the hilt, and projecting a dazzling, hollow illusion of wealth while secretly, quietly suffocating under a crushing, heavy mountain of high-interest consumer debt. Their entire financial strategy hinges entirely on blind, desperate hope for a miraculous lottery win, hope for a sudden, unexpected inheritance from a distant relative, or hope that a benevolent, faceless employer will eventually grant a minor, incremental salary increase. The sidewalker operates with an agonizingly short, highly reactive time horizon, living strictly for the immediate, dopamine-fueled thrill of today while aggressively, recklessly cannibalizing their own future survival. When an inevitable, entirely predictable macroeconomic shock occurs, a sudden corporate layoff, an unexpected medical emergency, a severe, global economic downturn, the fragile, glittering, and highly unstable facade of the sidewalker violently collapses in on itself, plunging them into absolute, inescapable ruin and deep psychological despair. Fleeing the terrifying, chaotic instability of the sidewalk, the majority of responsible, highly educated individuals deliberately choose the heavily paved, socially applauded, and incredibly crowded route of the slow lane. The slow lane is the ultimate, grueling marathon of extreme, lifelong, and highly celebrated mediocrity. The individuals marching endlessly on this path are the tragic, exhausted heroes of the modern economy. They possess the profound, difficult discipline that the sidewalker severely lacks. But they tragically apply that iron discipline to a mathematically flawed, fundamentally broken equation. They willingly enter the traditional education system, racking up massive, paralyzing, and inescapable student loans to acquire a degree that supposedly, magically guarantees a safe, secure, and permanent position within the corporate hierarchy. Once deeply embedded in the machine, they willingly sign a horrific, unseen, and highly destructive psychological contract. They agree to trade 5 long days of grueling, soul-crushing labor for 2 meager, fleeting days of exhausted freedom on the weekend. They hand over the absolute prime of their physical and mental vitality to an employer who views them strictly as an easily replaceable, highly disposable line item on a sprawling, complex corporate spreadsheet. The core, fatal mathematical flaw of the slow lane is that its entire, sluggish engine of wealth generation is inextricably tethered to intrinsic value, the practice of trading finite, severely limited human time for a fixed hourly wage or a stagnant, heavily taxed yearly salary. Because the physical universe strictly limits every human being to exactly 24 hours in a single day, the slowlaner's ability to significantly scale their income is mathematically, biologically, and permanently capped. They attempt to overcome this insurmountable mathematical barrier by placing their blind, unwavering faith in the so-called miracle of compound interest, funneling their hard-earned, post-tax dollars into volatile stock market index funds, desperately praying that consistent, historical returns will miraculously transform their modest, bleeding principal into millions over the agonizing, terrifying span of 4 long, exhausting decades. Analyzing the deep, psychological devastation of the slow lane reveals the cruelest, most insidious aspect of this socially acceptable trap. The slow lane entirely strips the individual of their sovereign, absolute control. The slowlaner's financial destiny is heavily, terrifyingly dependent on massive, unpredictable external forces over which they wield absolutely zero influence. They are entirely at the mercy of the whimsical, ruthless decisions of corporate executives who can swiftly terminate their employment with a single, callous email. They are at the mercy of a volatile, erratic global stock market that can violently erase an entire decade of meticulous, painful savings in a single, catastrophic afternoon of global panic selling. They are at the mercy of silent, invisible economic inflation, which constantly, relentlessly erodes the purchasing power of their hoarded currency, turning their future, distant millions into a fraction of their perceived value. The slowlander is essentially, tragically gambling the most precious, vibrant, and irreplaceable years of their existence on a highly fragile, heavily dependent strategy that promises a supposed, luxurious payout only when they have finally entered the twilight of their life. The narrative deeply highlights the profound, heartbreaking absurdity of this exchange, actively sacrificing the energetic, passionate, and incredibly potent years of one's 20s, 30s, and 40s just to ensure that one can afford expensive prescription medications and a premium nursing home in one's 70s. The protagonist of the narrative, experiencing this firsthand while working as a hired, physically exhausted limousine driver in the freezing, brutal, and unforgiving winters of Chicago, feels the icy, suffocating grip of the slow lane closing tightly around his throat, sitting alone in the driver's seat of a massive, luxurious vehicle he does not own, waiting for agonizing hours in the biting, relentless cold to ferry wealthy individuals to their warm, exclusive destinations. He realizes that his current trajectory is a guaranteed, inescapable death sentence for his ambitious dreams. He is merely surviving, existing as a biological, easily replaced battery powering someone else's fast-moving, incredibly lucrative machine. This agonizing, deeply painful realization catalyzes the protagonist's profound, desperate, and entirely radical pivot. He fundamentally understands that in order to completely, permanently alter the final, mathematical outcome of his life, he must aggressively, violently reject the heavily scripted variables of the slow lane equation. He absolutely cannot continue to trade his extremely limited, highly valuable time for a rigid, capped currency. He must sever the toxic, limiting connection between his physical presence and his income generation. He must find the elusive, incredibly powerful realm of the fast lane. The fast lane is absolutely not a magical, effortless scheme to generate overnight wealth. The narrative ruthlessly, aggressively attacks the toxic, ubiquitous illusion of get rich easy. The fast lane demands an immense, terrifying, and borderline obsessive volume of hard, grueling, and highly condensed front-loaded labor. However, the critical, world-altering distinction is the specific, strategic, and highly leveraged nature of that labor. While the slowlander works tirelessly to perform a repetitive, easily outsourced job, the fastlaner works tirelessly to construct a robust, autonomous system. The fastlane is a business, an innovative invention, a highly scalable software platform, or a massive, global distribution network that operates completely independently of the creator's physical time. It is a sprawling, powerful tree planted in fertile, rich soil. The fastlaner spends 5 to 10 years engaging in grueling, backbreaking labor to plant the seed, water the roots, and aggressively protect the fragile sapling from the harsh, highly competitive elements. But once that tree matures and its roots dig deep into the bedrock of the marketplace, it begins to bear fruit continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of whether the creator is actively tending to it, sleeping peacefully in their bed, or traveling across the globe. The profound, analytical lesson extracted from this initial, explosive phase of the journey is the absolute, non-negotiable requirement to transition from the deeply ingrained mindset of an unconscious, ravenous consumer to the mindset of a highly calculated, strategic producer. The entire modern world is perfectly, meticulously designed to trap individuals in the passive consumer mindset, bombarding them with relentless, highly targeted advertising, heavily encouraging them to buy the newest technological gadgets, the latest fashion trends, and the most expensive luxury vehicles. The fastlaner, however, looks at the exact same world through a completely inverted, highly analytical, and deeply critical lens. When they see a wildly popular, newly released product, they do not immediately desire to purchase it. They aggressively deconstruct the complex, underlying mechanics of how the manufacturing company produced it, how they brilliantly engineered the marketing campaign, and the precise, massive scale of the profit margins involved. They stop desperately seeking out mindless entertainment to passively consume and begin relentlessly, aggressively seeking out massive, painful problems that large, global populations of people are begging to have solved. The transition to the fast lane requires a complete, violent rewiring of the human brain. A massive shift from seeking immediate, fleeting comfort to embracing massive, highly strategic discomfort for a condensed, intensely focused period of time. The protagonist, staring out the icy, snow-covered windshield of the rented limousine, makes the terrifying, irreversible, and deeply liberating decision. He will completely, permanently abandon the cold, secure, and utterly miserable comfort of the slow lane. He will relocate across the country, strip his living expenses down to the absolute, bare minimum, and teach himself the highly complex, totally unfamiliar language of computer programming. He will begin the arduous, deeply lonely process of building his own autonomous machine, a digital system that will eventually, inevitably break the heavy, iron chains of his financial enslavement. The journey into the turbulent, highly risky, and incredibly rewarding waters of the fast lane has officially commenced, setting the grand stage for the discovery of the absolute, fundamental laws that govern the rapid, explosive accumulation of monumental wealth. The profound, agonizing transformation from a passive, exhausted consumer of circumstances into a highly lethal, calculated architect of autonomous wealth does not occur in a glamorous, brightly lit boardroom, nor does it happen on a heavily applauded public stage. It occurs in the dark, silent, and deeply isolating crucible of absolute sacrifice. The protagonist, having permanently abandoned the freezing, miserable confines of the rented limousine and the suffocating, predictable death march of the slow lane, locks himself away in a sparse, lonely apartment. He is entirely stripped of the comforting, numbing distractions that the masses use to medicate their quiet desperation. He surrounds himself with towering stacks of incredibly dense, frustratingly complex programming manuals, staring until his eyes burn at the glowing, unforgiving lines of digital code on a rudimentary computer monitor. He is no longer participating in the vibrant, social rhythms of normal society. He has voluntarily entered a period of extreme, monastic isolation, to maintain his fragile sanity during these grueling, seemingly endless nights of repeated failure and agonizingly slow progress. He violently anchors his mind to an ancient, incredibly powerful parable that perfectly, flawlessly encapsulates the monumental, world-altering shift he is attempting to engineer within his own life. It is the legendary story of the Egyptian pharaoh who summons his two young nephews, Azur and Chuma, presenting them with a monumental, virtually impossible challenge that will determine the ultimate succession of his royal, sprawling empire. The pharaoh commands each nephew to construct a massive, towering pyramid in the unforgiving, burning sands of the desert, promising absolute, unquestionable power and limitless, generational wealth to the one who completes the monumental structure first. Azur, fiercely embodying the quintessential, deeply flawed mindset of the traditional slowlander, reacts with immediate, explosive, and entirely uncalculated physical action. He rushes out into the blistering heat, relying strictly on his raw, biological strength to painfully, agonizingly drag massive, crushing stone blocks across the treacherous sand. For months, Azur makes highly visible, deeply celebrated progress. The masses cheer his grueling, relentless work ethic as the foundational layer of his pyramid slowly takes shape. He is the ultimate hero of the working class, trading his sweat, his tearing muscles, and his rapidly depleting life force for incremental, linear advancement. But as the pyramid inevitably grows taller, the brutal, mathematical reality of his chosen methodology violently crashes down upon him. The heavy stones become exponentially harder to lift. His biological energy hits a hard, insurmountable physical ceiling, and his progress grinds to an agonizing, microscopic crawl. He is entirely trapped in a failing, linear equation of physical effort versus reward, completely incapable of scaling his output beyond the fragile, breaking limits of his own human body. He inevitably, tragically dies broken, exhausted, and utterly defeated at the base of his unfinished, meaningless monument. Chuma, conversely, represents the visionary, highly strategic, and deeply analytical mindset of the fastlaner. When the pharaoh issues the monumental challenge, Chuma completely disappears. He retreats into a secluded, hidden workshop, entirely removing himself from the visible, sweating labor of the desert. The masses, heavily conditioned to solely respect visible, biological struggle, mercilessly mock him, labeling him lazy, delusional, and entirely incompetent while his designated patch of desert remains completely, embarrassingly empty. But Chuma is absolutely not resting, he is engaging in the deepest, most grueling form of intellectual and architectural labor. He is meticulously, obsessively engineering a massive, highly complex system of interlocking pulleys, heavy levers, and towering, structural cranes. When he finally emerges from his profound isolation, years after Azur began his agonizing, sweaty toil, Chuma does not attempt to lift a single, heavy stone with his bare, fragile hands. Instead, he deploys his monumental, carefully engineered machine. He uses the massive, exponential leverage of his mechanical system to effortlessly, rapidly hoist the colossal stone blocks high into the sky, completing his towering, magnificent pyramid in a mere fraction of the time it took Azur to even construct the fragile base. Azur traded his finite, bleeding life for linear progress. Chuma invested his time to build an autonomous system that delivered massive, exponential results, ascending to absolute, unquestionable power. The protagonist, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen, realizes with a rushing, intoxicating wave of clarity that learning to write complex software code is his version of retreating to the secluded workshop. His nascent, struggling digital platform is not a mere hobby, it is his towering crane. His complex pulley system, his mechanical lever that will eventually move massive, heavy mountains of wealth entirely without his physical exertion. As the digital bridge begins to slowly, painfully take shape, the narrative violently attacks the most pervasive, toxic, and highly destructive lie continuously peddled by modern, charismatic self-help gurus, the disastrous, blinding mandate to simply follow your passion. The protagonist intimately understands that the global economic marketplace is a cold, ruthless, incredibly efficient, and entirely unemotional entity. It does not care in the absolute slightest about his deeply held personal passions, his childhood hobbies, or his desperate, burning desire for financial liberation. It only cares about one fundamental, unyielding, and totally absolute metric: the successful, efficient resolution of a painful, widespread human problem. The protagonist completely, violently subdues his own fragile ego and rigorously, ruthlessly applies the commandment of need. He vividly remembers the deeply frustrated, freezing customers standing helplessly in the bitter snow, entirely unable to secure reliable transportation, and the desperate, struggling limousine companies rapidly bleeding cash because they could not connect with those freezing passengers. He is absolutely not spending thousands of hours coding a highly complex routing platform out of a deep, romantic, and passionate love for luxury limousines. He is building a highly efficient, necessary digital bridge to seamlessly connect a massive, agonizing supply with a desperate, deeply unmet demand. He learns the profound, unshakable truth that money is never the primary objective. Money is merely a trailing, mathematical indicator, a natural, inevitable byproduct of successfully, massively providing deep, undeniable value to the lives of other human beings. If you chase money, it will eternally elude your desperate grasp. If you aggressively, relentlessly chase the resolution of complex, painful problems, immense wealth will violently, inevitably hunt you down. With the crucial foundation of need securely established, the narrative exposes the critical, heavily guarded, and deeply intimidating gates that protect the incredible bounty of the fastlane, the commandment of entry. The protagonist astutely realizes that if a specific business model is incredibly easy to start, if it simply requires filling out a cheap, generic online form to eagerly join a multi-level marketing scheme, or opening a standard, uninspired storefront with absolutely zero specialized, difficult skills, it is a lethal, heavily saturated, and highly toxic trap. A low, easily breached barrier to entry mathematically guarantees a massive, suffocating, and entirely desperate flood of mediocre competitors, instantly driving profit margins down to a microscopic, heavily unsustainable fraction and turning the daily operation into a brutal, bloody war of attrition. The protagonist deliberately, highly strategically chooses a path heavily fraught with intense, Agonizing friction. By voluntarily locking himself in a sparse room for agonizing months, forcing his brain to painfully learn the highly complex, incredibly frustrating, and entirely foreign languages of advanced software engineering, he is actively, aggressively constructing a massive, towering, and heavily fortified wall around his emerging business. He is meticulously building a formidable, intimidating fortress that the lazy, entitled, and easily distracted masses of the slow lane will never, ever possess the sheer, agonizing, and relentless discipline to successfully scale. Difficulty is absolutely not a barrier to be feared. Difficulty is the ultimate, incredibly powerful filter that mercilessly weeds out the weak, ensuring that the immense, highly lucrative rewards of the marketplace are strictly, exclusively reserved for those willing to endure the searing pain of actual, rigorous creation. The digital system finally goes live, and the protagonist experiences the intoxicating, terrifying, and deeply chaotic thrill of early, raw traction. But the narrative abruptly, aggressively introduces the ultimate existential threat that silently destroys countless aspiring empires, the commandment of control. Many naive, highly hopeful entrepreneurs mistakenly, tragically build their fragile, beautiful castles entirely on rented, highly unstable land. They meticulously create engaging content exclusively for a third-party, deeply opaque social media algorithm, or they sell physical products entirely, desperately dependent on the fluctuating, arbitrary rules of a single, massive e-commerce giant. They are entirely hitchhikers, blindly, foolishly trusting a wealthy, unseen driver who can suddenly, without a single moment of warning, violently alter the route or aggressively, callously kick them out of the vehicle, instantly and permanently annihilating their entire source of income. The protagonist absolutely refuses to be a helpless, terrified passenger in his own financial destiny. He meticulously builds an independent, fully sovereign digital platform. He absolutely owns the foundational code. He strictly owns the highly valuable customer data, and he unilaterally dictates the exact pricing structure. He firmly establishes himself as the undisputed, absolute, and heavily armed monarch of his own digital kingdom, completely, permanently insulated from the devastating, arbitrary, and highly destructive policy changes of external, monopolistic corporate entities. To truly, permanently own your life, you must absolutely, unconditionally own the complete, underlying infrastructure of your primary wealth-generating machine. The ultimate, breathtaking, and entirely world-altering revelation occurs during a completely unremarkable, entirely silent Tuesday night. The protagonist is sound asleep in his bed, physically, biologically disconnected from any form of conscious labor. His body resting, completely inactive, thousands of miles away, in a completely different time zone. A desperate customer accesses his highly optimized digital platform, successfully books a luxury vehicle for an upcoming event, and the complex, automated software seamlessly, flawlessly processes the financial transaction. The protagonist wakes up the next morning, wipes the sleep from his eyes, checks his secure server logs, and discovers, with a sudden, massive, and deeply emotional shock to his nervous system, that his bank account has mathematically, undeniably expanded while his body was entirely at rest. He has successfully, triumphantly conquered the most elusive, powerful law of the universe, the commandment of time. He has finally, violently, and permanently severed the toxic, biological link between his physical, breathing presence and his ability to generate vast wealth. His digital machine has officially become a tireless, immortal, and incredibly efficient employee that operates fiercely 24 hours a day. Never demands a salary increase, never succumbs to physical or mental exhaustion, and never requires a vacation. He is no longer trading his finite, bleeding, and highly precious life force for a meager, heavily taxed currency. His beautifully engineered system is now doing the heavy, relentless lifting. The final, explosive, and highly necessary catalyst required to transform this comfortable, automated income into staggering, monumental, and entirely generational wealth is the absolute mastery of the commandment of scale. The protagonist profoundly realizes that successfully solving a painful problem for a dozen local people in a single neighborhood will yield a comfortable, modest, and entirely unnoteworthy living, but successfully solving a painful problem for millions of people across a vast, highly connected global network will inevitably yield staggering, incomprehensible, and paradigm-shifting wealth. Wealth is simply, beautifully defined as the uncompromising mathematical product of net profit multiplied by the total number of units sold or lives impacted. The exhausted, frustrated slowlander tragically attempts to marginally increase their wealth by desperately, pathetically begging their manager for a minor, insignificant percentage increase in their stagnant, heavily capped salary. The fierce, awakened fastlaner violently explodes their wealth by exponentially, aggressively increasing the sheer magnitude of their human impact. The protagonist takes his perfectly functioning, highly optimized digital platform and rapidly, aggressively expands its reach from a single, localized Midwestern city to a sprawling, massive, and highly integrated nationwide network, simultaneously serving thousands of hungry transportation companies and hundreds of thousands of desperate, searching consumers. He has successfully, flawlessly weaponized the ultimate, undisputed law of affection. The more individual human lives you significantly, positively affect in an environment you entirely, absolutely control, the richer you will inevitably, unavoidably become. He is no longer a shivering, exhausted driver waiting in the bitter cold for a meager tip. He is the undisputed master of a roaring, incredibly lucrative, and massively scaled digital machine, hurtling down the fast lane at a terrifying, exhilarating velocity, rapidly approaching the ultimate, highly guarded destination of absolute financial sovereignty, setting the grand stage for the final, brutal realization of how to successfully liquidate, preserve, and violently protect this newly forged empire from the predatory, ravenous forces of the outside world. The roaring, deafening velocity of the digital machine hurtling down the fast lane is absolutely exhilarating. But the intensely awakened protagonist is profoundly aware of a terrifying, deeply hidden truth that the vast majority of amateur entrepreneurs entirely fail to comprehend. Running a massive, highly successful, and rapidly scaling business is still, fundamentally, a form of active labor. Even with the most sophisticated, meticulously engineered automated systems flawlessly processing millions of digital transactions, the heavy, inescapable crown of absolute leadership inevitably demands a certain, undeniable fraction of the creator's psychological bandwidth and finite physical time. The ultimate, shining destination of this grueling, monumental journey is absolutely not to remain eternally chained to the roaring engine of the corporate entity they have birthed, constantly fighting the relentless, exhausting fires of human resources, aggressive competitors, and shifting market dynamics. The true, absolute pinnacle of the fast lane philosophy, the staggering, world-altering event that completely severs the final, remaining biological tether between the human creator and their financial obligation, is the highly strategic, incredibly lucrative liquidation event. The protagonist deeply understands that they have aggressively, painstakingly built a towering, incredibly valuable, and highly coveted cash-generating asset, and to truly, permanently secure absolute, generational sovereignty, they must inevitably, violently convert that illiquid, operational asset into a massive, undeniable, and entirely unencumbered mountain of pure, liquid capital. As the digital empire continues its aggressive, unstoppable expansion, aggressively dominating the transportation logistics market and completely obliterating the slow, archaic, and deeply inefficient traditional competitors, the massive, circling apex predators of the global corporate ecosystem inevitably take notice. Towering, heavily capitalized private equity firms and massive, monolithic technology conglomerates, desperate to instantly acquire the massive, highly engaged user base and the flawless, proprietary underlying software architecture that the protagonist has built, begin to aggressively, relentlessly circle the fortress. The protagonist absolutely does not enter these incredibly high-stakes, terrifying negotiations as a desperate, pleading subordinate seeking a meager payout. They enter the massive, glass-walled boardrooms as an undisputed, heavily armed, and entirely sovereign monarch negotiating from a position of absolute, unassailable strength. They know the exact, profound mathematical value of the intense, painful years they spent isolated in the dark, coding the structural foundations of their empire while the rest of the world engaged in mindless, fleeting entertainment. After months of grueling, intense, and highly complex legal and financial sparring, the definitive, world-altering contract is finally, decisively signed. The protagonist walks out of the sterile, corporate tower, steps out into the bright, blinding sunlight, and awaits the silent, digital transaction that will permanently, violently alter the entire fabric of their existence. The moment the monumental wire transfer successfully clears the labyrinthine global banking system, the psychological shockwave that hits the protagonist is utterly staggering, deeply emotional, and almost physically paralyzing. They stare at the glowing screen of their secure financial dashboard, entirely unable to fully process the sheer, incomprehensible magnitude of the number reflecting back at them. The account balance has not merely increased by a comfortable, incremental margin, it has violently, aggressively exploded from a healthy, operational business reserve into a staggering, multi-million-dollar, 8-figure fortune in a single, silent, and entirely invisible digital heartbeat. In that specific, breathtaking fraction of a second, the protagonist has mathematically, undeniably achieved what the exhausted, heavily conditioned slowlander desperately prays to achieve over 4 long, agonizing, and entirely miserable decades of extreme frugality and volatile market gambling. They have completely, permanently bypassed the slow, decaying march of time. They are incredibly wealthy. They are completely unburdened by operational corporate debt. And, most crucially, importantly, and profoundly, they are still incredibly young. Their biological vitality completely intact. Their vast, boundless future entirely, sovereignly theirs to command. However, the narrative aggressively, urgently warns that this massive, intoxicating influx of sudden, staggering wealth is the exact, highly dangerous precipice where countless, unprepared individuals tragically, predictably plunge back into the dark, chaotic abyss of the sidewalk. The deeply ingrained, toxic consumer programming of modern society immediately, violently attempts to reassert its heavy, manipulative control. The sudden, overwhelming ability to purchase sprawling, multi-million-dollar estates, fleets of depreciating, hyper-expensive exotic vehicles, and endless, empty luxury experiences creates a terrifying, highly seductive siren song that can rapidly, mercilessly bleed even the most massive, towering fortune entirely dry. The protagonist violently, aggressively rejects this highly destructive impulse. They deeply understand that while their fastlane business was the towering, powerful crane that lifted the massive, heavy blocks of wealth into the sky, they now desperately require an entirely new, deeply defensive, and entirely passive architecture to permanently, violently protect that wealth from the corrosive, relentless forces of economic inflation, heavy governmental taxation, and their own, highly flawed human impulses. They transition their towering, monumental fortune into the ultimate, impenetrable fortress of the money system. The protagonist absolutely does not take their newly acquired, staggering millions and recklessly, foolishly throw them into highly volatile, deeply unpredictable, and aggressively risky speculative stock market ventures, because they profoundly recognize that the stock market is absolutely not a reliable engine for the initial, rapid creation of massive wealth. It is, instead, a highly efficient, necessary vehicle for the aggressive preservation and steady, passive distribution of wealth that has already been independently generated. They meticulously, carefully deploy their massive capital base into highly secure, unshakable, and historically reliable, high-yield financial instruments, tax-free municipal bonds, deeply entrenched, globally diversified dividend-paying blue-chip equities, and incredibly stable, cash-flowing commercial real estate trusts. By deploying an 8-figure capital base into these incredibly safe, deeply boring, and entirely unglamorous vehicles, the resulting, mathematically guaranteed yield generates a roaring, massive, and entirely passive monthly income stream that utterly dwarfs the highest, most elite salaries of the corporate executive world. The protagonist is now quietly, effortlessly earning tens of thousands of dollars every single month in pure, unadulterated interest, completely entirely independent of their physical exertion, and entirely without ever touching, diminishing, or risking the massive, protective principle of their core fortune. They have successfully, flawlessly transformed their active, fastlane business triumph into a permanent, immortal, and endlessly yielding money tree. To successfully, permanently defend this magnificent, towering money tree from the massive, highly sophisticated armies of financial predators, the slick, commission-hungry wealth advisors, the aggressive, predatory legal opportunists, and the silent, invisible, and heavily destructive thief of global economic inflation, the protagonist must aggressively, relentlessly weaponize the ultimate, absolutely non-negotiable shield of deep, uncompromising financial literacy. They profoundly realize that they can absolutely never, under any circumstances, blindly outsource the fundamental, deeply complex mechanics of their own financial empire to a third-party entity who ultimately, inevitably cares far more about their own extracted management fees than the preservation of the protagonist's deeply hard-won sovereignty. The protagonist aggressively immerses themselves in the highly complex, arcane languages of international tax law, intricate corporate structuring, advanced asset protection trusts, and macroeconomic monetary policy. They transform their brilliant, highly analytical mind from a lethal software engineer into an impenetrable, heavily armed guardian of vast capital. They meticulously construct a sprawling, highly complex, and heavily legally fortified network of holding companies and impenetrable, irrevocable trusts, ensuring that their massive, hard-won empire is completely, permanently insulated from any conceivable, malicious external attack, frivolous litigation, or catastrophic, systemic economic collapse. The fortress is entirely, flawlessly complete, the moat is incredibly deep, heavily guarded, and entirely unbreachable. The grand, sweeping narrative finally reaches its ultimate, breathtaking, and deeply emotional culmination. The protagonist, entirely, absolutely free from the crushing, heavy gravitational pull of the traditional economic machine, returns to the very same quiet, unremarkable suburban street where their monumental, world-altering journey first began. They walk into the identical, familiar ice cream shop, but the heavy, suffocating, and deeply paralyzing aura of quiet desperation and mediocre expectations that once choked their lungs has completely, entirely vanished. They walk back out into the bright, warm sunlight, and parked effortlessly by the curb is their own pristine, breathtakingly aggressive, and fiercely angled Lamborghini. But as the iconic, dramatic scissor door violently swings upward, the protagonist experiences a profound, deeply spiritual, and entirely transcendent realization that fundamentally shatters the final, lingering illusion of the material world. The exotic, wildly expensive vehicle is absolutely not the true, ultimate prize of this grueling, monumental journey. The car is merely a piece of incredibly well-engineered metal, a fun, fleeting, and highly unnecessary toy. The car does not represent a desperate, pathetic plea for social validation, nor does it represent a hollow, deeply insecure attempt to project artificial status to a world of complete strangers. The vehicle is a profoundly personal, entirely private, and deeply emotional monument to the sheer, unadulterated, and terrifying power of their own sovereign will. It is a physical, undeniable manifestation of their absolute, flawless victory over the heavily rigged, deeply cynical, and incredibly oppressive script that society attempted to forcefully chain around their neck. They slide into the low, aggressively bolstered leather seat, grip the steering wheel, and deeply, profoundly realize that true, absolute, and enduring wealth is a sacred, unbreakable trinity that the vast majority of humanity completely, tragically misunderstands. True wealth is absolutely not defined by the sheer volume of material possessions hoarded in a massive, echoing mansion. True wealth is the vibrant, unbreakable, and deeply authentic connection of family and cherished relationships. It is the robust, highly energized, and completely disease-free vitality of physical health, and it is, most importantly, supremely, and undeniably, the absolute, unshakable, and entirely boundless freedom of choice. Money is entirely, completely meaningless on its own. It is simply the heavy, highly effective ammunition required to aggressively defend the perimeter of your physical health. To deeply, generously nourish the profound relationships of your chosen tribe, and to permanently, violently buy back every single remaining second of your finite, rapidly ticking mortality. The protagonist fires the massive, roaring engine, the deafening, mechanical scream echoing off the quiet suburban buildings, a triumphant, undeniably victorious roar that symbolizes the absolute, total annihilation of the slow lane illusion. They shift the heavy transmission into gear, completely unburdened by an alarm clock, absolutely unchained from an employer, and entirely, overwhelmingly free to drive their life in any conceivable, magnificent direction they so choose, for the rest of their natural, deeply sovereign existence. The ultimate, earth-shattering meaning that the millionaire fastlane fiercely, aggressively intends to convey to its readers is a complete, violent, and highly intellectual revolution against the deeply entrenched, globally accepted dogma of lifelong, exhausted financial servitude. The core, beating message is that the prevailing mandate to merely survive the present in the desperate, pathetic hope of a comfortable, distant, and physically declining future is a massive, carefully orchestrated, and highly destructive mathematical lie designed to harvest your youth. The book serves as a profound, transformative psychological and highly systemic blueprint, teaching that by aggressively abandoning the deeply toxic consumer mindset, heavily prioritizing the uncompromising resolution of massive human needs, and rigorously engineering highly scalable, entirely autonomous systems decoupled from your physical time, you can effectively hack the universe and violently accelerate the accumulation of generational wealth. The final, transcendent lesson is one of radical, terrifying, and beautifully uncompromising liberation. You do not have to wait until the twilight of your existence to finally experience the intoxicating, boundless joy of absolute freedom. Wealth is not a marathon to be survived in old age, it is a rapid, explosive sprint to be violently conquered in the vibrant prime of your youth.